The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story ever told, a complete modern retelling of the ancient Mesopotamian epic of kings, gods, friendship, and the search for immortality by Wren and Sable Classics. Introduction. Imagine a library buried under the weight of 2,000 years of dust. Imagine a story so old that the people who first told it didn't use paper or ink because those things hadn't been perfected yet. Instead, they pressed a reed into wet clay, marking it with tiny, wedge-shaped symbols, and then baked those tablets in the sun. For centuries, those tablets sat in the dark, forgotten in the ruins of a city called Nineveh, while empires rose and fell above them. The world moved on. We forgot that Gilgamesh ever existed. We forgot his name, his city, and his heart-shattering grief. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, explorers started digging. They found thousands of these broken clay shards and shipped them back to the British Museum. There, a self-taught scholar named George Smith began the painstaking work of piecing them back together. One day, as he translated the symbols, he realized he was reading a story about a massive, world-ending flood. It was a story that looked almost exactly like the account of Noah's Ark in the Bible, but this version was much, much older. Smith was so shocked and excited that he reportedly started tearing off his clothes in the middle of the room. He knew he had found something that would change how we understand history forever. That story is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is the oldest great work of literature we have. It predates the Homeric epics of Greece by 1,000 years. It predates the written parts of the Old Testament. But the reason we are still talking about it today isn't just because it's old. It's because it is incredibly, almost shockingly modern in its emotions. When you listen to this story, you aren't just looking at a museum piece. You are looking into a mirror. It turns out that 4,000 years ago, humans were worried about the exact same things we are worried about today. We were worried about our legacies. We were worried about finding a person who truly understands us. And most of all, we were terrified of the fact that one day, our hearts would stop beating. At the start of the story, Gilgamesh is a nightmare. He is the king of Uruk, a man who is 2/3 god and 1/3 human. He is beautiful, he is terrifyingly strong, and he is a total tyrant. He's the kind of leader who takes whatever he wants and works his people to the bone because he has too much energy and nowhere to put it. He's a man who has everything, but possesses no wisdom. So the people pray to the gods for relief, and the gods respond by creating a rival for him, a wild man named Enkidu. Enkidu lives in the steppe with the animals. He is hairy, unwashed, and innocent. When these two finally meet, they don't sit down for a chat. They have a massive, wall-shaking fistfight. But in the middle of that violence, something clicks. They realize they are equals. This is the birth of the first great bromance in human history. Enkidu tames Gilgamesh's rough edges, and Gilgamesh gives Enkidu a place in the civilized world. They become inseparable. They go on grand adventures. They slay monsters in enchanted forests, and they insult the gods themselves. They feel invincible. But that's the trap of being human. We feel invincible right up until the moment we realize we aren't. When the gods decide that one of them must pay for their arrogance, they choose Enkidu. He doesn't die a hero's death in battle. He dies slowly and painfully in bed, wasting away while his friend watches in horror. This is where the story shifts from a monster-hunting adventure into something much deeper. Gilgamesh doesn't just mourn. He loses his mind. He refuses to bury his friend for days, hoping Enkidu will just wake up. When the reality finally sinks in, Gilgamesh is hit by a realization that haunts every one of us. If it happened to Enkidu, it will happen to me. The king of Uruk strips off his royal robes, puts on lion skins, and wanders into the desert. He abandons his kingdom to search for the one thing no human has ever found, the secret to living forever. His journey takes him to the ends of the earth. He meets Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who was granted immortality by the gods. Gilgamesh is looking for a magic pill, a shortcut, a way to cheat the system. But the answer he gets is a hard one. He is told that death is woven into the fabric of being human. You can't have the life without the ending. It's a bitter lesson, and Gilgamesh tries and fails several times to prove he's worthy of more. He even finds a plant that restores youth, only to have a snake steal it from him while he's bathing. It's almost funny in a tragic way. It's the universe telling him to stop trying to be a god and start being a man. In the end, Gilgamesh returns home. He doesn't have the secret to eternal life. He's older, he's tired, and his best friend is still dead. But as he approaches his city, He looks up at the walls of Uruk. He looks at the brickwork, the orchards, and the temples. He realizes that while he won't live forever, the things he builds and the way he leads can endure. He finds peace not in escaping death, but in accepting his place in the cycle of life. This story has survived fire, war, and the literal burial of its civilization. It was lost for 2,000 years, but it waited for us to find it again. It feels like a message in a bottle, sent from the very beginning of the human experience. It tells us that it's okay to be afraid. It tells us that friendship is the only thing that makes the journey bearable. And it tells us that our time here is short, which is exactly what makes it beautiful. So, let's go back to where it all started. Let's walk across the plains of Mesopotamia and approach the great city. The sun is hot, the dust is rising, and the king is waiting. The king who had everything. Look upon the walls of Uruk. Go up, walk along their crest, and see how they encircle the city like a copper girdle. Touch the bricks, they are kiln-fired, every one of them, hard as mountain stone, and laid by the hands of the 7 sages who rose from the deep at the beginning of time. See the foundations of the temple of Eanna, the dwelling of Ishtar, mistress of love and war. Foundations so deep they touch the roots of the world. Look at the palm groves, the orchards, the brick pits, and the vast squares where the people gather. This is Uruk, the crown of the world, and all of it belongs to one man. His name is Gilgamesh. He is the king, the shepherd, and the storm. He was born of the wild cow Ninsun, a goddess of infinite wisdom, and his father was the priest king Lugalbanda. This heritage left him 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a ratio that is the source of all his glory and all his grief. To be 2/3 god is to have a spirit that is too large for a human frame, a heart that beats with the rhythm of the tides, and a mind that cannot find rest in the small, quiet lives of mortal men. He is a giant among children, a lion in a pen of sheep, and his beauty is so blinding that it is almost a physical blow to those who look upon him. But Gilgamesh was not a kind king. He was a king who had everything, and because he had everything, he hungered for something he could not name. He walked the streets of Uruk with a stride that shook the earth, and his arrogance was as tall as the ziggurat. He was a shepherd who did not care for the flock, but rather devoured it. He claimed the right of the first night, taking every bride before her husband could touch her, leaving a trail of weeping families in his wake. He drove the young men of the city to exhaustion, forcing them into endless games of strength, into the building of monuments, and into wars that served only to burn away his own boredom. The people of Uruk groaned under the weight of his vitality. Their lives were a relentless thunder of his making. In the dark of night, the elders of the city whispered to the heavens, and the mothers cried out from their beds. They asked the gods if this was what a king was meant to be. Is a king not supposed to be a father to his people? Is he not the one who provides shade? This Gilgamesh is a wildfire, they cried. He is a wild bull on the rampage. Give us peace, or give him a rival. Give him someone who can match his strength, so that Uruk might finally breathe. The gods, lounging in their celestial courts, heard the clamor of the mortals. They looked down through the clouds and saw Gilgamesh, a golden figure of restless energy, pacing his palace like a trapped predator. They saw his brilliance and his cruelty, and they understood that the people were right. Gilgamesh was a masterpiece of creation. He was a solo instrument, playing at a deafening volume. He needed a harmony, or perhaps a discord, to make the music of his life complete. Anu, the father of the gods, called out to Aruru, the great mother, the potter who had first molded humanity from the dust. You created him, Aruru, Anu said. Now create his equal. Let there be a second self for Gilgamesh, a man who is his mirror image. Let them be like 2 storm clouds meeting in the sky. Let them struggle against one another so that Uruk may find rest. Aruru listened. She washed her hands in the clear waters of the river and took a pinch of clay. She did not look to the city for her inspiration, nor to the temples of the gods. She looked to the deep, silent places of the earth. She envisioned a creature who was the very soul of the wilderness, a being who knew nothing of walls, of kings, or of the taste of bread. She molded the clay with her divine fingers, breathing life into the cold earth, and then she cast it down into the great steppe, the vast grasslands that stretched out beyond the horizon of Uruk. There, in the silence of the wild, Enkidu was born. He rose from the dust, a man of staggering power, but he was not like the men of the city. His body was covered in thick, matted hair like the hide of a beast. The hair of his head was long and flowing, waving like the heads of grain in a field. He knew nothing of people, nothing of language, nothing of the complex webs of law and desire that govern the lives of those within the walls. He was a man, but he was also a brother to the animals. Enkidu lived with the gazelles. He ate the grass of the hills with them, his teeth grinding the tough stalks. He ran with the wild herds, his lungs pumping the cool mountain air. And when the sun grew hot, he knelt at the watering holes beside the lions and the deer, drinking his fill from the same pools. He was the protector of the wild. If a hunter set a trap, Enkidu's powerful hands would tear the mesh of the nets. If a pit was dug to catch a beast, Enkidu would fill it with earth. He was a shadow in the grass, a force of nature that the animals did not fear, but that men began to speak of in trembling whispers. Back in Uruk, Gilgamesh remained unaware that his shadow had been cast upon the earth. He continued his reign of magnificent excess. He stood on his balcony and watched the sun set over the Euphrates, his heart a cavern of unfulfilled longing. He had the finest wines, the most beautiful women, the strongest walls, and the highest honors. Yet he felt as though he were starving. He was a man waiting for a storm he could not see coming. The news of the wild man eventually reached the king's ears through a terrified hunter who had seen Enkidu at the watering hole. The hunter described a being who was stronger than any man, a creature who walked like a god but lived like a wolf. Gilgamesh listened, and for the first time in years, his eyes lit up with something other than boredom or lust. He did not feel fear. He felt a strange magnetic pull. Deep in the two-thirds of his heart that was divine, something stirred. He told the hunter to take a priestess, a harlot of the temple named Shamhat, and go to the wilderness. He knew that to bring the wild man to the city, one must first bridge the gap between the animal and the human. He knew that the wild man's innocence was his strength, and that, once that innocence was touched by the complexities of human desire, the animals would no longer recognize him as their own. But that was for the days to come. For now, the world was divided into two halves. In the golden, crowded, noisy city of Uruk, there was Gilgamesh, the king who had everything and yet possessed nothing that could satisfy him. He was the peak of civilization, the master of the brick and the blade, a man who had conquered the earth but remained a prisoner of his own restless spirit. And out in the vast, green silence of the steppe, there was Enkidu. He was the earth itself, uncarved and unburdened. He slept under the stars and woke with the dew, his heart beating in time with the migrations of the herds. He was the answer to a prayer he had never heard, the rival and the brother who would soon change the course of history. The air between the city and the wild grew heavy, as if the atmosphere itself were bracing for an impact. The gods watched from above, leaning over the battlements of heaven. They had set the pieces on the board. They had created the king of the walls and the king of the weeds. They had prepared a collision that would echo through the millennia, a story of how two halves of a single soul would find each other, and in doing so, discover the terrible, beautiful weight of being human. Gilgamesh sat on his throne, tapping his fingers against the armrest of lapis lazuli. He looked out over his kingdom, at the smoke rising from the kilns and the bustle of the markets. He felt a shiver of anticipation, a premonition of a change so profound that the very foundations of Uruk might tremble. Somewhere out there, in the dark grass of the world's edge, his destiny was drinking from a stream, looking up at the same moon that shone through the palace windows. The king who had everything was about to learn that he had nothing, until he had a friend, and the wild man who had nothing was about to learn that to be human is to lose the world in order to find a soul. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the long, ancient song of Gilgamesh and Enkidu was about to begin. The Wild Man. In the beginning of the world's memory, before the names of the great kings were carved into the blue stone of the mountains, there was Uruk. It was a city of baked brick and high walls, a jewel set in the dust of Mesopotamia. But its people were not happy. Their king, Gilgamesh, was 2/3 god and 1/3 man, and the divine part of him burned like a fire that could not be quenched. He was too strong for his subjects, too restless for the confines of a city. He took the sons for his wars and the daughters for his bed, and his energy was a storm that flattened the wheat in the fields. The people cried out to the gods, asking for someone who could match his strength, someone who could stand before him and be his mirror, so that Uruk might find peace. The gods listened. Aruru, the mother of creation, the one who shaped the first clay of humanity, dipped her hands into the cool water of a sacred pool and pinched off a piece of the earth. She threw it into the heart of the great wild steppe, far from the smoke of the hearths and the sound of the loom. In that silence, Enkidu was born. He did not come as an infant, but as a man grown, a creature of raw power and shaggy grace. His body was covered in hair that flowed like the waves of a ripened grain field, and the locks on his head grew long like the tresses of a woman. He knew nothing of people, nothing of the tilled soil or the taste of cooked meat. He lived among the gazelles, eating the bitter grass of the plains, and when he was thirsty, he knelt beside the wild beasts at the watering hole, his heart beating in time with the thundering hooves of the herd. For a long time, Enkidu was a phantom of the wilderness, a shadow that moved with the animals. He was their protector. If a pit was dug to catch a deer, Enkidu filled it with earth. If a snare was set for a wolf, Enkidu snapped the wire with his massive fingers. He was the wild's own vengeance against the cunning of man. But one morning, a young trapper, a boy who lived by the skill of his hands, came down to the watering hole to check his nets. He saw Enkidu standing there in the morning mist, a giant of a man, matted with mud and fur, his eyes glowing with the fierce intelligence of a creature that has never known a master. The trapper was struck with a terror so deep it turned his blood to ice. He fled back to his father's hut, his face pale and drawn, like a man who has stared into the face of his own death. He told his father of the wild man who broke the traps and freed the game, a man so powerful that even the lions seemed to give him room. The father, wise in the ways of the world, knew that no hunter's spear could bring down such a creature. He told his son to go to Uruk, to the high palace of Gilgamesh, and ask for a woman of the temple. He told him to find Shamhat, the priestess harlot, whose beauty was a weapon, and whose touch was the beginning of wisdom. For the father knew a secret that the wild man did not, that the wild cannot resist the pull of the human soul once it has been awakened by desire and the soft mysteries of civilization. The trapper traveled to the city of the high walls and stood before Gilgamesh. The king, intrigued by the story of a rival who lived like a beast, granted the request. He sent Shamhat with the boy, and for 3 days they traveled back into the burning silence of the steppe. They sat by the watering hole and waited. On the first day, the animals came to drink, but the wild man was not among them. On the second day, the dust rose on the horizon and the herd approached, but still, the wild man remained in the deep hills. But on the third day, Enkidu came. He moved with the easy, rolling gait of a predator, his skin bronzed by the sun and smelling of the open sky. Shamhat did not hide. When Enkidu saw her, he stopped. He had never seen a woman. He had never seen the soft curves of a human face or the deliberate light in a human eye. Shamhat opened her robe and let it fall to the dust. She showed him the beauty of the body, the invitation of the flesh. Enkidu, driven by an instinct he did not understand, came to her. For 6 days and 7 nights, they remained together in the tall grass. In that time, the world of the beasts began to slip away from him. He was no longer just a body moving through the world. He was becoming a mind that could remember, a heart that could yearn. When the 7 nights were finished, Enkidu rose. He felt a strange heaviness in his limbs, a slowness he had never known. He turned back toward the watering hole, wanting to run with the gazelles, wanting to feel the rush of the wind against his chest as he sprinted across the plains. But when the animals saw him, they turned and fled. The gazelles bounded away into the distance, and the wild sheep scattered. Enkidu tried to follow them, but his knees failed him. He could not keep pace. He was no longer one of them. He had been touched by the world of men, and the scent of the wild had been washed away by the scent of Shamhat. He returned to her, weeping, feeling the first sharp pang of loneliness that only humans know. But Shamhat took his hand and spoke to him with a voice like honey. She told him that he was beautiful, that he was like a god. Why, she asked, should he want to run with the beasts of the field when he could walk among men? She told him of Uruk, the city of the 7 gates, where the people wore brightly colored clothes and every day was a festival. She told him of Gilgamesh, the king whose strength was a mountain, and she promised that in Gilgamesh, Enkidu would find a brother, a man who could understand the fire that burned in his own breast. Enkidu listened, and as he listened, his desire for the herd was replaced by a desire for a friend. He wanted to see this Gilgamesh. He wanted to challenge him to see if there was truly another in the world who was his equal. Shamhat led him away from the deep wilderness to a camp of shepherds on the edge of the cultivated lands. It was here that Enkidu's true education began. The shepherds gathered around him in wonder, whispering to each other that he looked like a twin of Gilgamesh, though shorter and broader, with the muscle of the mountains in his shoulders. They set food before him, bread baked in the embers of a fire. Enkidu stared at it. He did not know what it was, He had only ever sucked the milk of wild beasts or chewed on the roots of the earth. He sniffed the bread and pulled back, confused. Then they set a flagon of beer before him, the golden brew of the harvest. Enkidu looked at the foam and the bubbles and did not know how to drink. Shamhat laughed softly and told him that this was the way of men. She told him to eat the bread, for it is the staff of life, and to drink the beer, for it is the custom of the land. So Enkidu ate until he was full, and he drank 7 goblets of the strong dark ale. His heart grew light, and his face began to glow. The world seemed bright and full of possibility. He took a razor and shaved the long matted hair from his body. He rubbed himself with sweet-smelling oils until his skin shone like bronze. They brought him a garment of fine wool, and when he put it on he looked like a bridegroom. He was a man now. He took a weapon and went out into the night to guard the shepherd's flocks. Where once he had protected the wolves, he now hunted them. He sat awake while the shepherd slept, his eyes scanning the darkness, a sentinel between the wild and the light of the hearth. But the peace of the shepherd's camp could not hold a man like Enkidu for long. One day, a traveler passed by the camp, hurrying toward Uruk with a look of distress on his face. Enkidu stopped him and asked where he was going in such a rush. The traveler told him of the news from the city. He spoke of the king Gilgamesh and the wedding feast that was being prepared. But it was a feast of sorrow, for Gilgamesh had claimed a terrible right, the right to sleep with every bride on her wedding night before her husband could touch her. The king's lust and his power knew no bounds, and the people of Uruk could do nothing but weep. When Enkidu heard this, a great rage woke up inside him. It was not the mindless fury of a beast, but the righteous anger of a man who knows that something is fundamentally wrong. He did not understand the laws of kings, but he understood the law of the heart. He saw the injustice of it, the cruelty of a man who used his strength to crush the joy of others. "I will go to Uruk," Enkidu declared, his voice like the roll of thunder. "I will stand in the street, and I will cry out to this king. I will challenge him. I will tell him that I am the one born of the wild, the one whose strength was forged in the silence of the steppe. I will see if his power can stand against the truth of a brother." Shamhat saw the fire in his eyes and knew that the time had come. She had brought him out of the darkness of the beast into the light of the soul, and now the two halves of the world, the wild and the city, were destined to meet. She led him toward the high, shimmering walls of Uruk. As they approached the gates, the people began to gather, whispering in the shadows, watching the bronze-skinned stranger who walked with the stride of a lion. They saw in him the answer to their prayers, the weight that might finally balance the scales of their king's restless heart. Enkidu did not look at the temples or the gold. He looked only for the man who called himself a god, ready to find his destiny in the dust of the city streets. The wrestling match. The sun hung heavy over the city of Uruk, a great eye of brass watching the walls of burnt brick that Gilgamesh had built. In those days, Uruk was the jewel of the world, its ramparts gleaming with bitumen and its temples rising like mountains of stone toward the heavens. But inside those walls, the air was thick with a different kind of heat, the heat of a city held in the grip of a king who knew no limit. Gilgamesh, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, was a storm that never broke. He was a wild bull who trampled his own people, taking the sons for his armies and the daughters for his bed. He was beautiful, he was terrifying, and he was profoundly alone, though he did not yet know the word for what ached inside his chest. Far beyond the gates, where the grass of the steppe grows tall and the gazelles run with the wind, another power had stirred. Enkidu, the man of the wild, had been brought into the light of humanity. He had been born of clay and silence, covered in hair like the god of corn, living among the beasts, until the priestess Shamhat had taught him the ways of men. He had tasted bread and found it strange. He had drunk wine and felt his heart grow light. He had been scrubbed of his wildness, his long hair trimmed, his body anointed with oils. But though he wore the clothes of a man and spoke the tongue of the city, the strength of the mountain stayed in his marrow. He was the shadow to Gilgamesh's light, the silence to the king's roar. As Enkidu walked toward Uruk, led by the hand of Shamhat, he listened to the travelers on the road. They spoke in hushed, bitter tones of the king's latest decree. Gilgamesh, they said, had claimed the right of the first night. When a young man took a bride, the king would be the first to enter the marriage chamber. He would take what belonged to the husband, for he was the king, and who could say no to a god? When Enkidu heard this, his face darkened. In the wild, The bull protects the herd. He does not devour it. A cold, righteous fury settled into his bones, a fury he did not yet understand, for he had never known a law other than the turning of the seasons. I will go to Uruk, Enkidu told Shamhat, his voice like the grinding of stones. I will challenge this king. I will cry out in the streets that I am the one who was born in the hills, the one whose strength is the equal of his own. I will change the order of things. They entered the gates of Uruk, and the city was a revelation of noise and color. Enkidu marveled at the markets, the smell of roasting meat, and the sheer press of human bodies. The people of Uruk gathered around him, whispering. They saw the breadth of his shoulders, and the way he moved with the predatory grace of a lion. He is like Gilgamesh, they whispered, hope flickering in their tired eyes. He is the only one who can stand against the storm. Night fell, and the torches were lit along the streets. A wedding was being prepared. The drums thrummed, and the pipes wailed a shrill, festive tune, but there was a shadow over the celebration. The bridegroom stood trembling in the courtyard of the wedding house, his family weeping in the corners, for they knew the king was coming. Suddenly the crowd parted. The sound of heavy sandals on stone echoed through the alleyway. Gilgamesh approached. He was draped in fine linen and gold, his beard curled and perfumed, his eyes bright with an arrogance that bordered on madness. He moved with the absolute certainty of a man who has never been told no. He reached the door of the wedding house, his hand extending toward the latch, ready to claim his prize. But the door did not open. Enkidu stood there, a pillar of earth and muscle blocking the way. He did not speak. He simply planted his feet on the threshold, his eyes locked onto the king's. The music died. The whispers ceased. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in the crannies of the brickwork. Gilgamesh looked at the stranger. He saw a man who did not bow, a man who did not tremble. Step aside, the king said, his voice low and dangerous, like the growl of a summer storm. Enkidu did not move. You shall not enter this house, he said. The rights of the husband are his own. You are a king, not a thief of joy. For a moment, there was a silence so profound that one could hear the flickering of the torches. Then Gilgamesh lunged. It was not a fight of blades or spears. It was the collision of two primal forces, a wrestling match that would be remembered as long as the stars stayed in the sky. Gilgamesh grappled with Enkidu, and Enkidu locked his arms around the king. They spilled out of the doorway and into the street, their bodies crashing against the walls of the houses. The sound was like the calving of glaciers. When they struck the doorposts, the heavy timbers groaned and splintered. The very foundations of Uruk seemed to shudder under the weight of their struggle. They were like two wild bulls with locked horns, their feet digging furrows into the packed earth of the street. Dust rose in a choking cloud, turning the torchlight into a dim, ghostly haze. Gilgamesh had always been the strongest. He had wrestled lions and pinned them to the earth. He had outrun the deer. He expected this stranger to break, to gasp, to fall. But Enkidu was like the mountain itself. Every time Gilgamesh threw his weight forward, he found a resistance that was absolute. Enkidu's grip was like iron bands. His breath was steady, smelling of the open air and the herbs of the field. They rolled in the dirt, their muscles bulging, until it seemed their skin might tear. They were slick with sweat and blood, their fine clothes reduced to rags. To the people watching from the rooftops, it looked as if two gods were dismantling the city piece by piece. A wall collapsed under the force of a shove. A gate was wrenched from its hinges as they tumbled through it. There was no hatred in the fight. It was something deeper, a recognition. With every thrust and parry, with every heaving breath, they were learning one another. Gilgamesh felt for the first time in his life the limit of his own power. He felt the shock of meeting an equal. He felt the loneliness that had lived in him like a hollow cave suddenly being filled by the presence of this other being. Enkidu likewise felt the fire of the king's spirit. He saw the divinity that burned behind Gilgamesh's eyes, a restless, beautiful hunger that matched his own wild origins. The struggle went on until the moon was high, their lungs burning, their limbs trembling with the effort of holding back a force as great as their own. Finally, Gilgamesh managed to throw Enkidu, pinning him for a fleeting second. But as he did, he felt his own strength fail. He stepped back, his chest heaving, his gold ornaments scattered in the dust. He looked at Enkidu, who was rising slowly, wiping the blood from his lip. The king's anger was gone. evaporated in the heat of the struggle. In its place was a profound, staggering wonder. Who are you? Gilgamesh asked.